At 3:07 a.m., 12 military vehicles locked down every exit of Harlow General Hospital in Denton, Nevada. Armed soldiers moved through the corridors, with flashlights cutting the dark. In the trauma bay, a special operations sergeant was dying, his lung collapsing, his heart stuttering, his blood pressure in freefall. The attending physician stood frozen. The monitors screamed. And in the parking lot, standing in the rain with a cardboard box of her belongings, a nurse who had just been fired 60 minutes earlier heard that sound through the walls. She recognized it immediately. She had heard it before, in a war zone. Before this story goes any further, if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this channel delivers stories that will leave you speechless, and you will not want to miss what comes next for this woman. And while you're at it, drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The rain had been falling on Denton since midnight, the kind of slow, relentless Nevada rain that soaks through everything and makes the whole world feel like it's closing in. Maren Coyle stood at the edge of the hospital's east parking lot, her scrub jacket already plastered to her shoulders, one arm wrapped around a cardboard box that held 7 years of her professional life. A coffee mug with a chipped handle. A laminated ACLS reference card she'd memorized years ago but kept anyway. A photograph of her dog, a scarred German shepherd named Tuck, taken on the morning she'd first brought him home from the rescue. That was it. That was everything she'd accumulated at Harlow General Hospital, and none of it weighed more than a few pounds. She was 31 years old, and she had just been fired. She stood there for a moment, not moving toward her car, just letting the rain hit her face. Inside the hospital, the shift was continuing without her. Somewhere in Sumpt's building, a chest pain patient named Gerald Favre was sleeping in Bay 4, hooked to a monitor that no one was watching the way she had been watching it. She'd flagged his rhythm twice in the last hour. Twice, doctor. Owen Brackett had looked at her the way men like him looked at nurses who said things they didn't want to hear like. She was a child at an adult table who'd accidentally used the wrong fork. His troponin is within range. Brackett had told her the second time, not looking up from his chart. His EKG is borderline. You're reading anxiety into a bored 62-year-old man. His ST segments are trending, she'd said. They weren't flat an hour ago. Maren. He had said her name like it was a period at the end of a sentence. I've been doing this for 22 years. I know. But the trend is not your call to make. She'd documented her concerns in the nursing notes. She'd flagged the monitor. She'd asked the charge nurse, Dominic Fuertes, to take a look. And Dominic had looked and said, I mean, it's borderline, in that tone that meant he saw what she saw, but wasn't going to be the one to push back on Brackett. Nobody pushed back on Brackett. He was the head of the emergency department. He had the handshake of a politician and the confidence of someone who had never once in his life been told he was wrong, by someone whose opinion he respected. Maren had gone back to the bedside and kept watching Gerald Favre anyway. 40 minutes passed. She split her attention between Favre and 2 other patients, charting vitals, running labs to the printer, answering a call light in Bay 7. She was not paranoid. She was not escalating for the sake of escalating. She had simply been paying attention for long enough to know that the numbers in Bay 4 were not staying where Brackett expected them to stay. Every time she walked past, she looked. Every time she looked, something in her gut said, not yet, but soon. At 1:40 a.m., Favre's monitor threw a PVC run that made her stomach drop. She was in the hallway when she heard the change in rhythm from 30 feet away. She knew that sound the way musicians know a flat note, and she had walked fast back into Bay 4 and pressed the call button and said clearly, I need a physician in Bay 4 now. Brackett arrived 40 seconds later, looking like she had personally inconvenienced him. He's in PVC salvo, she said. He needs a cardiology consult and a repeat enzyme panel, and he needs it now. Brackett looked at the monitor. He looked at Favre. He stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and then he said, "I'll order a repeat EKG. He needs cardiology, and I'll make that determination." Dr. Brackett. "You're disrupting my department," he said it quietly. That was worse than shouting. Again, she had been disrupting his department. That was what he called it when she was right about something he'd missed. She had disrupted his department 3 months ago, when she'd flagged a pediatric patient's oxygen saturation and pushed for a chest x-ray that nobody wanted to order at 2 in the morning, and which ultimately showed early-stage pneumonia. She had disrupted his department 6 weeks ago when she'd caught a drug interaction in a discharge summary that Brackett had signed off on without reading carefully. She had been written up both times, formally, for insubordination. At 1:58 a.m., Gerald Favre coded, the team worked on him for 11 minutes before he was stable enough to be transferred. The interventional cardiology team came down and determined he'd had a massive STEMI, a total blockage of the left anterior descending artery, the one cardiologists called the widowmaker. If he'd gone another 20 minutes without intervention, he would have died. Brackett had not acknowledged her in the chaos. He had moved through the code efficiently and without expression. And afterward, he had walked directly to the nursing station and filled out a formal complaint against Maren for excessive escalation, failure to follow physician directives, and creating a hostile and disruptive environment. She had been called into the nursing director's office at 2:23 a.m. The nursing director, Sylvia Crane, was a woman who had learned long ago that her position depended on her ability to avoid confrontation with the physicians who generated the department's revenue. She had a kind face and careful eyes, and she read from the complaint in a flat voice. And when Maren said the patient coded, Sylvia had nodded slowly and said, "I understand," and the team responded appropriately. I flagged him twice. The physician ignored both flags. That's a serious allegation, Maren. It's documented in my nursing notes. Dr. Brackett feels that your pattern of second-guessing his clinical judgment has become a recurring issue. His judgment nearly killed a patient tonight. His judgment nearly killed a patient tonight. Sylvia had folded her hands on the desk and looked at Maren for a long moment with something that might have been sympathy if it hadn't been so carefully controlled. "We're going to need to place you on administrative leave pending a review of tonight's events. Effective immediately. You're suspending me. We're..." For being right, Sylvia had not answered that. Maren had cleaned out her locker in 10 minutes. She hadn't cried. She had wanted to. There was a tightness in her chest that she recognized as the precursor to it, but she had not. She had walked through the department without looking at anyone, and Dominic had said her name once in the hallway, quietly, and she had kept walking. She didn't blame Dominic. She understood exactly why he'd stayed quiet. She understood it. She just couldn't respect it. Now she was in the parking lot in the rain, and she was letting herself feel the full weight of it, because she had learned a long time ago, in a very different kind of darkness, that you had to actually feel things before you could move past them. You couldn't outrun it. You just had to stand in it for a minute and let it be real. 7 years has. 7 years of night shifts and missed Thanksgivings and relationships that had frayed because she was always either sleeping or working or too wrung out to be fully present anywhere. 7 years of being the nurse who remembered every patient's name, who stayed late to hold a hand or explain a diagnosis in plain language, or catch something on a monitor that everyone else had glossed over. 7 years of learning quietly and without any expectation of recognition how to be excellent at a job that the people above her had decided wasn't worth listening to. She thought about the first week she had worked at Harlow General, when she was 24 and still carrying the particular tension of someone transitioning from one world into a completely different one. She had arrived with her nursing license and her civilian clothes and a deliberately ordinary resume, and she had learned within the first month that nobody here needed to know where she had been before. They didn't need to know what she had done there. They didn't need to know about the 11 minutes that still woke her up at 3 in the morning sometimes, in her apartment with Tuck pressed warm against her legs, the details so vivid she had to sit up and count things in the room lamp, window, door, ceiling fan, her own hands, to confirm she was here and not there. She had built a quiet life. That had been the plan. That had been the point. Now she was standing in a parking lot in the rain with a cardboard box. She had started walking toward her car, her shoes already soaked through, when she heard the ambulance. It came in fast, not the standard controlled arrival, but the lights and sound urgency that meant something had gone badly wrong in transit. She turned without thinking, her feet stopping before her brain caught up, and she watched the bay doors slam open as the paramedics came through with a gurney at a run. The patient was a young man, military bearing, even horizontal and unconscious. There was something in the set of his shoulders, the way his body held its posture, even in crisis, that she recognized. His uniform was partially cut away. The paramedic calling out the report was a woman with close-cropped hair who moved with the particular economy of someone who had given hundreds of these handoffs. 26-year-old male, training accident at Fort Hauser, blunt chest trauma, significant left respiratory distress, BP 88/60 and dropping SATs, tanking 62% on 15 liters decreased breath, sounds on the left. Maren heard the number 62%, and her stomach clenched. She didn't walk closer. She couldn't. She wasn't on staff anymore. She was standing in the parking lot with a box of her belongings, with a box clinical belongings, and no badge and no clinical authority, and the thing she had to do right now was get in her car and go home and figure out what came next. She kept watching. Brackett was in the bay. She could see him through the glass. He'd come in from somewhere, still in his white coat, and he was running the intake the way he always ran trauma cases, with the controlled efficiency that had earned him his reputation. He was good in a crisis. She had never disputed that. What she disputed was what happened in the margins, in the quieter moments when the monitors were borderline and the data wasn't screaming, and someone whose title was smaller than his was trying to tell him something he didn't want to hear. She watched him look at the chest X-ray on the portable unit. She watched him study it for perhaps 4 seconds. She watched the respiratory therapist set up for intubation. She stopped breathing, the soldier on the table. She could see his chest from where she stood through the rain-streaked glass at an angle that gave her just enough of a view. His chest was not rising symmetrically. The left side was working hard, too hard, and his neck she tilted slightly. To see better, his neck veins were distended, visible even from the parking lot against the bay lighting. She knew what she was looking at. She had seen it before. Not in a hospital. Somewhere else entirely, in conditions that made this rainy Nevada parking lot feel like a very safe place. And in a moment when she had made a decision that had haunted her for 4 years, in the way only life and death decisions can haunt a person. Not because she had made the wrong choice, but because the world had later told her she had, and she had spent years unable to fully argue back. Attention pneumothorax. Air trapped in the chest cavity with no way out, compressing the heart and great vessels, driving the blood pressure into the floor. You did not intubate a tension pneumothorax. You decompressed it. You put a needle in the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and you let the air escape, and you did it immediately, because the clock on a tension pneumo was not a clock with minutes, it was a clock with seconds. Brackett was prepping the laryngoscope. She watched one of the nurses in the bay say something to him. She watched him respond without looking up from what he was doing. She watched the nurse take a half step back, the way nurses at Harlow General took half steps back when Brackett used that particular tone. The soldier's monitor, she couldn't hear it, but she could see the waveform on the portable. through the glass. Through a rhythm she recognized as a heart that was struggling to fill, fighting against the pressure crushing it from the outside. Maren set her cardboard box down on the wet pavement. She looked at it for half a second. The chipped mug, the laminated card, Tuck's photograph, and then she walked toward the ambulance bay door. The first person who saw her was a tech named Roberto, who had worked at Harlow General for 11 years and knew Maren's face well enough to look immediately confused. "Maren, I need gloves," she said, moving past him. "And I need someone to tell Dr. Brackett that patient has a tension pneumo." You don't have gloves, Roberto." He grabbed a pair from the cart by reflex. He'd been handing her things for 5 years, and muscle memory didn't care about administrative leave. She was inside the bay before Brackett saw her. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, which he recognized the way people recognize sounds they've learned to dread, and his expression moved through surprise and then irritation and landed somewhere that was pure, cold authority. "What are you doing in here?" "That man has a tension pneumo." She said it the way she said clinical facts, without apology, without hedging. "His SATs are in the 60s, his BP is crashing, his neck veins are up, and his breath sounds are absent on the left. Intubating him will kill him. You were removed from this department. He needs needle decompression." Right now, the respiratory therapist had paused with the laryngoscope in hand. Everyone in the room had that particular stillness of people watching a thing unfold that they weren't sure how to stop and weren't sure they wanted to. Brackett's voice dropped to something controlled and precise. "Security. I need security in Bay 1. "Fine," Maren said. "Call security. But while you're waiting for them, look at his neck." She said it loudly, enough that the respiratory therapist heard. The RTA young woman named Dara, whom Maren had worked alongside for 2 years, looked at the soldier's neck. Dara's eyes stayed there for 2 full seconds, then 3. "His JVD is significant," Dara said, quietly, to nobody in particular, to everybody. Brackett's jaw tightened. "His trachea's midline," said the second-year resident, Nate Proctor, who had been watching the exchange with the expression of someone calculating odds under pressure. But his SATs just dropped to 59. The monitor confirmed it, with a tone change that everyone in the room felt somewhere in their chests. 59%. Maren didn't wait for the debate to finish. She stepped to the crash cart, pulled a 14-gauge angiocath, and moved to the left side of the patient. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady in moments like this. It was outside of her crisis that her hands gave her trouble in nursing directors' offices, in parking lots, in the apartments of people she had cared about and eventually lost because she could never fully. She sometimes lay home, why she sometimes sat up in the dark at 3 a.m., counting objects in the room. In a trauma bay, with a dying patient in front of her, her hands were instruments. They knew what to do. They had always known. Stop. Brackett's voice cracked like a whip. "Do not touch that patient. He's going to arrest in 90 seconds. You do not have clinical authority." She found the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She felt the anatomy under her fingers, the way she'd felt it once before, under different light, with rain hitting a different kind of roof overhead, and the sound of something much louder than a monitor alarm filling the air around her. "Maren." It was Dara. Her voice was not an objection. It was something else, a witness, bearing witness. She inserted the needle. The rush of air was immediate and unmistakable, a hiss that filled the room, a release of pressure that was both clinical event and something almost viscerally human, the sound of a body freed from what was crushing it. The soldier's oxygen saturation began to climb on the monitor. 57, 61, 68. His blood pressure, 88/60. Then 94, then 101. His heart rate, which had been a terrified 138, slowed toward something survivable. Nobody spoke. Even the monitors seemed to pause for the length of a breath, and then they continued doing what monitors did. And they continued reporting numbers that now, for the first time since the ambulance arrived, were moving in the right direction. Brackett had not moved from where he stood at the head of the bed. The laryngoscope was still in his hand. He was watching the numbers climb with an expression that she didn't look at directly because she didn't have the time or the inclination. "He still needs a chest tube," she said to the room. "The needle buys time. Someone needs to place a tube before that decompression reverses." Nate Proctor said, "I can place it." Brackett turned toward him with a look that Proctor clearly registered because he took a small step back. But then Proctor looked at the soldier's monitor again, and he didn't fully retreat. Security arrived at the bay door, two of them in their gray uniforms, looking between Maren and the attending physician, waiting for someone to tell them what the situation actually was. Brackett looked at Maren with something in his face that had moved past anger into a territory she didn't have a clean name for. Get her out. She didn't fight it. She'd done what she came in to do. The soldier was breathing. His numbers were stabilizing. The room knew what had happened here, and so did she, and neither of those things was going to change based on whether she walked out or was escorted. She peeled off the gloves, dropped them in the biohazard bin at the bay's edge, walked toward the door with her chin level and her breathing controlled, and the particular stillness of someone who has learned not to give anything extra away. She was at the threshold when Dara's voice stopped her cold. His BP just crashed again. Maren turned around. The monitor confirmed it instantly, that specific hollow drop in the waveform, the heart losing its architecture. The chest tube had not been placed. The needle decompression had done its work, but without a tube to maintain drainage, the pressure was rebuilding. The same crisis returning, faster this time. Because the lung was already compromised and had no reserves left to compensate. Nate Proctor was reaching for the chest tube kit. His hands were moving fast, but his movements had the edge of someone doing something in real conditions that they had only practiced in simulation. And the difference was visible in the slight hesitation between each step that shouldn't have been there. Maren walked back in. Security stepped aside. Nobody stopped her. Not Brackett, who was at the monitor with his back partially turned. Not the techs. Not Dara, who moved to create space at the bedside without being asked. She stopped next to Proctor and looked at his setup. "Talk me through your landmarks." He glanced at her. His jaw was tight. 5th intercostal, mid-axillary line. "Good. Make your incision confident, don't second guess once you commit. Hesitation is the one thing that makes this worse." He looked at her for one more second. Then he made the incision. He was competent. She had watched him work before, and she knew what he was capable of when the noise around him quieted enough to let him function. The tube went in correctly on the first pass. The drainage immediate and the volume appropriate, blood tinged, the amount expected from blunt chest trauma, not the hemorrhagic flood that would have indicated something catastrophic underneath. The soldier's numbers climbed for the second time. This time they held. His oxygen saturation rose past 70, past 80, past 90. His blood pressure steadied at 104, over 68. His heart rate came down from the edge and settled at 96. Still elevated, but functional, a heart finding its rhythm again after being given room to work. She exhaled through her nose. She looked at the soldier's trauma band. His name was there in the standard block lettering. SGT D'Anvers, Fort Hazaropas, 26 years old. She had guessed right. He had the build of someone who trained for function rather than appearance, and even sedated and tubed now, appropriately, with the color returning slowly to his face. There was something in how he occupied the space that she recognized the way you recognize an accent immediately, without being able to fully explain what the tell was. She stepped back from the bedside. The room was organizing itself around the patient now with the purposeful rhythm of a trauma bay that had come through the acute phase and was moving into stabilization. The crisis had resolved. The next steps were defined. The machine was working the way it was supposed to work. Maren turned toward the door. 3 people were standing in it. 2 wore army uniforms, dress uniforms, not field gear, the kind you wore for official things, for formal things, for things that were going to be documented. Her eyes read their rank insignia automatically, the way they always had, before she consciously decided to look. Colonel, Major, both of them standing with the particular weight of people who have authority and know it and don't need to announce it. The third was a woman in civilian clothes who held herself exactly the way the uniformed officers held themselves, with that posture that wasn't rigidity, but was something learned over years and maintained without thinking because it had become structural, part of how the body understood itself. She was perhaps 50, close-cut silver hair, reading glasses on a chain around her neck that seemed like the one genuinely civilian thing about her. Her face was composed in the particular way of people who have waited for things before and know how to do it without showing the weight. She was looking directly at Maren, not at the patient, not at the physicians, not at the room, at Maren, and her expression held no surprise. None at all. Not the surprise of someone who had arrived, expecting to find a body on a table, and instead found a nurse running the resuscitation. Not the confusion of someone encountering an unexpected variable. She had known before she walked through that door exactly who she would find in this room. The woman reached up and removed her reading glasses from around her neck, folding them with one hand, and she said something quietly enough that only Maren caught it. 4 words, spoken the way you speak things you have rehearsed for exactly the right moment. Staff Sergeant Coyle. Hello. The rank. The name. Together. The 2 things Maren had spent 4 years making sure did not exist in the same sentence in the state of Nevada. Something happened in her chest that she didn't have a word for. Not fear. Not quite. Something older than fear, with more history attached to it. Outside, through the bay doors she had walked through twice tonight, more vehicles were pulling into the hospital's entrance lot. Not ambulances, not civilian cars and parking in the patient drop-off lane. Military vehicles, positioned with the deliberate geometry of people who had a plan and were executing it. Sealing points of egress, the way you sealed them when you wanted to make sure that a conversation that needed to happen was going to happen. Maren had seen vehicles positioned like that once before. In a valley, in the dark, during 11 minutes that the official record said had gone one way, and her memory said had gone another way entirely. The silver-haired woman took one step forward. "We need to talk," she said. "About Black Ridge Pass." The woman with the silver hair did not move from the doorway, and Maren did not move from where she stood, and for a moment the trauma bay held 2 separate realities in the same space. The clinical one, where nurses were securing lines and Nate Proctor was documenting his tube placement, and Dara was rechecking the soldier's vitals with the focused efficiency of someone managing a stabilized patient. And the other one, the one that had just walked in through the door in dress uniform and civilian clothes and 4 words that should not have existed in this building. Brackett was the first person to break the stillness. Excuse me. He addressed the uniformed officers with the particular confidence of a man who believed his authority was universal and portable, transferable to any room he walked into, regardless of who else was in it. "This is an active trauma bay. I'm going to need you to wait outside until Dr. Brackett." The colonel spoke without looking at him. He was looking at Maren. "We're aware of where we are. We'll need a few minutes with this nurse. This nurse has been terminated from this facility and is currently here without authorizations. We're aware of that too." The colonel's voice had that quality that Maren recognized from a long time ago. The flat, final quality of someone who had run out of patience for a specific kind of argument about who had authority in a given space and had decided that the fastest resolution was simply to state the answer and wait for the other person to catch up. Brackett heard it and processed it, and his chin came up slightly, the way it did when he was recalibrating his approach rather than retreating. He looked at Maren. His expression was complicated and cold. "Whatever this is," he said, quietly. It doesn't change what happened tonight. She didn't respond to that. The silver-haired woman stepped forward into the bay, far enough that she was no longer in the doorframe, close enough that she was speaking at a conversational distance. She had the reading glasses folded in her left hand. Her right hand she held at her side, and there was something deliberate about the stillness of it. "I'm Reeves," she said. "Catherine Reeves. DIA, currently attached to the Army Special Operations and Command Medical Oversight Division." She paused for half a beat. That's a long title for a specific job, which is why most people just call me Reeves. Maren said nothing. "The man on that table is Sergeant Dylan Vare," Reeves continued. "He's assigned to a unit that doesn't have a public designation. What I can tell you is that his medical file is classified at a level that means the people in this hospital cannot access it, cannot treat him with full information, and cannot make informed decisions about his ongoing care without someone who has the appropriate clearance and the appropriate background. You need a military physician," Maren said. "I have 2 of them. They're 20 minutes out." Reeves glanced at the monitor, at the climbing numbers, at the chest tube secured at Vare's left side. 20 minutes ago, Sergeant Vare was dying. He's not dying now. That's because of decisions you made in the last... She checked her watch. The motion, economical 14 minutes. "I performed a needle decompression and supervised a chest tube placement. That's a procedure, not a decision. Knowing which procedure, in which order, at which moment, when the attending physician in the room was prepared to intubate attention." Pneumo Reeves tilted her head slightly. "That's a decision." Brackett had not left the bay. He was standing near the monitor with his arms crossed, and he was listening to all of this with an expression that was working hard to stay neutral. Maren could see the effort it was costing him. "Doctor." Brackett, the colonel again, still not looking at him. "We're going to need the room. This is my department, and Sergeant Vare is Army property." The colonel said it without heat, the same way you'd say the sky was overcast. Factual. Non-negotiable. "Your team can return in 15 minutes. We'll call you if his condition changes." The word property landed strangely. Maren had heard it used that way before, in briefings, in paperwork, in the specific bureaucratic language of an institution that needed a word for people that was both respectful and transactional. She had never liked it. Brackett looked at his team, Dara, Proctor, the 2 techs, and made the decision that men like him made when they understood that the math had changed and the argument they prepared was no longer the right argument for the room. He walked out. The others followed. The bay doors swung shut behind them. The room was quieter without them. The monitors continued. Vare's chest rose and fell with the slow, assisted rhythm of a man whose body was doing the work of recovering. Reeves looked at Maren for a long moment. Then she said, "We can do this here, or we can do this in a room down the hall. Either way, it happens. You know I'm not currently employed by this hospital." "I know. We'll come back to that." Reeves pulled a chair from near the supply shelf and sat down, which was not the posture Maren had expected. She had expected standing, the formal construction of an interview or a debrief. Sitting was something else. Sitting, someone who planned to be in the room for a while and wanted both of them to be on the same level. 4 years ago, you separated from the Army at the rank of staff sergeant after 6 years of service as an Army flight medic. You had 2 combat deployments, a combat medical badge, and a service record that read before the last entry, as one of the stronger medical CENTOs in your unit. Maren said nothing. Before you separated, there was an incident. Classified, designated internally as Black Ridge Pass. The official report characterized the incident as a medical failure during a CASVAC operation that resulted in the death of one operator. Reeves folded the reading glasses open and then shut again. A habit. That report said the failure was yours. The monitors tracked Vare's heart rate. 91. Steady. That report, Maren said carefully, is what it is. Yes. Reeves nodded slowly. It is what it is. which is why we're here. She looked up at Maren directly. We've been looking at Black Ridge Pass for 7 months. Not because of you, specifically. Because of something else that came out of a separate investigation into equipment procurement fraud in the SOCOM medical supply chain. And what we found when we pulled the original field documentation was that the report on file does not match the field documentation. Something moved through Maren's chest. She kept her face still. She had a lot of practice keeping her face still. The report on file says the CASVAC window was 3 minutes, she said. The field documentation says 11. The report on file says I failed to recognize attention. The field documentation, Reeves said, quietly but precisely, says you did recognize it, treated it correctly, and that the operator who died had sustained injuries during the initial contact that were already non-survivable. Injuries that were documented at the scene and then not included in the final report. The silence that followed was not empty. It had weight and texture and 4 years of a particular kind of living compressed into it. The living you did when you had been told by an institution you had served, that you had failed at the most important moment of your career, and you could not prove otherwise, and so you had taken your nursing license and your dog and a city in Nevada that was far from anyone who knew the name Black Ridge Pass, and you had tried to build something ordinary. Maren sat down on the edge of the supply shelf. Not graceful, just real. The body deciding that standing was taking more than it had to give right now. Why are you telling me this here? She asked. Tonight. Because Sergeant Vare was the one who filed the original field report. The real one. Before it was altered. Reeves's voice was level, but there was something underneath it that Maren was trying to read. He was a PFC then. He filed it because he was there, and he wrote down what he saw the way soldiers are supposed to. 18 months later, when he'd been promoted and transferred, he found out the official record didn't match what he wrote, and he started making inquiries. She paused. Those inquiries are what got him flagged. And the accident tonight at Fort Hauser? Maren went still. Is under review, Reeves finished. We're not calling it anything yet, but we're not calling it something either. The implication settled into the room like weather. Maren sat with it. He filed a report that could clear my name, she said. And now he's on a table with a collapsed lung after a training accident. After a training accident in which he was the only person seriously injured. During a drill he had run 20 times before without incident. Maren looked at Vare. His color was improving. Whatever his body was doing, it was doing it with the stubborn efficiency of someone young and strong and trained hard, working against the damage rather than surrendering to it. Who altered the report? She asked. That's what we're building toward. Reeves stood. She was done sitting, which is why I need to know whether you're willing to talk to us formally, on record, about what happened at Black Ridge Pass from your perspective, with the understanding that what you provide will be used as part of an active investigation and may result in significant consequences for the people involved in the alteration. Consequences for who? Currently, we're looking at 2 senior officers who were in the chain of command during the incident and who had both the access and the motive to alter the report. One of them is retired. One of them is not. Maren looked at her hands. She had spent 14 minutes saving a man's life tonight, and her hands still had the steadiness in them, the muscle memory of something going right. She thought about what it meant that Dylan Vare had spent a year and a half trying to correct a record that had destroyed a stranger's career, a stranger he'd never met, a staff sergeant who had kept him breathing during 11 impossible minutes in a place neither of them had wanted to be. She thought about Gerald Favre sleeping somewhere in this hospital right now because his widowmaker had been caught in time. She thought about the formal complaint in her personnel file, and Sylvia Crane's carefully folded hands, and Dominic saying her name in the hallway, and then going quiet. And she thought about the 7 years before all of that, when she had been something other than a nurse that people overlooked in a hospital in Nevada. She had not thought that version of herself was coming back. She had not been sure she wanted it to. Yes, she said. I'll talk to you. Reeves nodded once, in the way of someone who had expected that answer but needed to hear it said out loud before moving forward. She looked at the colonel, who made a small gesture toward the door, and the major a small gesture toward the door, and the major moved to coordinate something in the hallway that Maren couldn't see, but could infer from the low-frequency activity she could hear on the other side of the bay doors. What followed was not the debrief she had braced for. Reeves took her to a consultation room, 2 floors up a small, beige, forgettable room with a table and 4 chairs and a window that looked out onto the parking lot, where Maren's cardboard box was sitting in the rain, disintegrating slowly. The photograph of Tuck was in there. She thought about that briefly and then stopped thinking about it, because it wasn't useful. The colonel introduced himself as Colonel Marcus Ede, and he had a recorder on the table and a legal pad and a pen, and he was the kind of man who took notes even when the recorder was running, because he had learned at some point that the act of writing things down changed how carefully you listened. The major's name was Pollen, and she mostly observed. Reeves sat across from Maren and began from the beginning. Not Blackridge Pass. Before it. What unit? What role? What training? What deployments? The architecture of Maren's military career, built piece by piece in the beige room, while downstairs a soldier she had kept alive twice was being prepped for transfer to a military medical facility. Maren answered everything. She had not talked about any of this in 4 years, and the experience of saying it aloud was strange. Not cathartic, not the relief she might have expected, but something more like archaeological. Like excavating something she had buried carefully and finding it intact. Still there. Still exactly what it was. When they reached Blackridge Pass, she told it straight. The mission parameters, the contact, the casualty report coming over the radio, the CASVAC window, what she had found when she reached the downed operators, 3 injured, 1 critically, 1 already dead from wounds she had assessed on arrival as unsurvivable. She had documented that assessment in the field log. She had made the decision to concentrate resources on the 3 with survivable injuries. She had performed emergency decompression on 1 of them, the same procedure she had performed tonight in the same sequence, with the same anatomy under her hands, and she had kept all 3 of them alive until extraction. The operator who died had been dead before she reached him. His injuries were what they were. She had documented it. She had filed her report, and then, 14 months later, she had received a notification that a formal review of the incident had concluded with findings that differed materially from what she remembered and what she had written. She had been given 30 days to contest the findings. She had been 27 years old. She had been 27 years old, and she had not known something that large from inside an institution that had already decided this. And she had made the choice that people made when they were young and exhausted, and certain that fighting was going to cost more than they had left to spend. She had separated. She had left. She had regretted it in the specific chronic way you regretted a decision you made when you were not yet the person you would later become. Reeves listened to all of it without interrupting, which was its own kind of respect. When Maren finished, the room was quiet for a moment, and Reeves turned to Ede, and they had a short exchange in the clipped, abbreviated language of people who had worked together long enough to communicate efficiently, and then Reeves turned back. The field log you mentioned, your original documentation from Blackridge Pass. Do you know if you kept a copy? I wasn't supposed to. I know. Do you have one? Maren looked at her. There's a drive. In a safe deposit box in a bank in Reno. I put it there 3 years ago when I realized I might eventually need it and didn't trust myself to have it somewhere easy to access, because easy to access meant easy to look at, and I wasn't ready to look at it. Something moved across Reeves's face. Not surprise. Something that was almost like respect, or maybe the recognition of a specific kind of survival strategy. We're going to need that drive. I know. Can you get it tomorrow? I can get it today. The bank opens at 9. Ede made a note. The conversation shifted then, moved into the terrain of what came next, the formal process, the timeline, the investigation's current state. Maren listened and absorbed and asked the questions she needed to ask. And when there was a knock at the door and a young specialist leaned in to say that Sergeant Vare was being prepped for transport and was asking for the doctor who had treated him, Reeves raised an eyebrow at Maren. He doesn't know who you are, Reeves said. Not yet. As far as he knows, you're an ER nurse who happened to be on shift. I wasn't on shift. He doesn't know that either. Maren thought about the name on the trauma band. Dylan Vare, the man who had written down what he saw and then spent a year and a half trying to make the record match the truth, and who had ended up on a trauma table in Nevada for his trouble. She thought about what kind of person did that filed a report about a stranger's correct decision in a classified incident years after the fact at cost to himself, because it was wrong that the record said otherwise. She stood. I'll go. The transport hallway was a different kind of quiet from the trauma bay controlled, purposeful, the organized movement of people transferring a patient from one level of care to the next. Vare was on a gurney, intubated and sedated, flanked by 2 military medical personnel who had arrived while Maren was upstairs. His monitor showed numbers that were, given where they had been 90 minutes ago, remarkable. One of the military medics, a young woman with the specialist's rank, looked at the chest tube placement and the needle decompression site, and then looked at Maren with an expression that was not quite a question and not quite a statement. Good work, she said. Maren nodded once. It was not a moment for more than that. She stood at the edge of the hallway and watched them move, Sergeant Dylan Vare, toward the elevator. And she thought about the drive in the safe deposit box in Reno and the field log it contained, and the 11 minutes it documented with the precision of someone who had known, even in the middle of it, that she might someday need the record to exist. She had been right to keep it. She had been right about Gerald Favre. She had been right about Vare's lung. She had been right about Blackridge Pass. She had spent 4 years in a hospital being told that right wasn't her call to make. She was still standing in the hallway when the elevator doors closed, and Reeves came up beside her, and for a moment they stood in parallel, looking at the closed doors. Your termination tonight, Reeves said, from this hospital. We have some standing to address that, given that you were providing emergency care to an active duty service member in a situation where the civilian attending was about to make a fatal error. I performed an unauthorized procedure on a patient after being removed from staff. You saved a service member's life. Twice. Reeves let that sit for a moment. The Army's interest in this hospital's employment decisions is limited. But our interest in the people who make those decisions, she paused, is not. Maren turned to look at her. Reeves was looking at the elevator doors. We've been reviewing Harlow General's procurement records as part of the broader investigation. The medical supply chain fraud we mentioned. This hospital is on the list of facilities we're looking at. The hallway felt narrower than it had a moment ago. Bracket? Maren said. That's not something I can tell you yet. Reeves turned to face her. What I can tell you is that tonight was not an isolated event, and that the people who fired you tonight, she paused again with the precision of someone choosing words that were accurate without being premature, may have reasons beyond your performance evaluations for wanting you out of this building. The quiet that followed was a different kind from all the other quiets that had collected in this night. It was the quiet of a thing becoming larger than it had appeared, of a story that Maren had believed was about her career and her record and her 7 years in an emergency department, turning, in real time, into something with more moving parts and more history than she had understood. She looked at the elevator doors. She thought about Owen Brackett, standing at the head of a trauma table with a laryngoscope in his hand while a soldier's oxygen saturation dropped into the 50s. She thought about the way he had moved through Gerald Favre's code efficiently, correctly, without a single acknowledgement of the flags she had raised that had bought Favre the time to still be alive when the code happened. She thought about the 2 formal complaints in her personnel file. The pattern. She thought about the word procurement. How long has this investigation been running? She asked. 7 months on the supply chain piece. Black Ridge Pass, 3 weeks. Reeves paused. The connection between them is newer than that. How new? Reeves looked at her. 48 hours. Maren felt something shift in the architecture of the night, the way the ground shifts in the moment before you realize you've been standing on something that was never as solid as it looked. 48 hours. 2 days ago, nobody had connected the procurement fraud to the altered report to the accident at Fort Hauser to a fired nurse standing in a parking lot in Nevada with a cardboard box. And now all of those things were connected. In this hallway. At 3:40 in the morning. She opened her mouth to ask the next question. Her phone buzzed in her scrub pocket. She pulled it out, reflexively habit, the body's memory of being on call, and looked at the screen. The number was unknown, Nevada area code, but no contact name attached. The text was 3 words. They know you're there. Maren stared at the screen for 3 seconds. 3 words. Unknown number. Nevada area code. The timestamp read 3:47 a.m., which meant someone had sent it while she was in the consultation room, 2 floors up, while she was talking to Reeves and Ede and building the architecture of everything she'd buried for 4 years. Someone who knew she was in this building. She turned the phone toward Reeves without a word. Reeves read it. Her expression didn't change the way a civilian's expression would have changed. No sharp intake of breath, no visible alarm. What happened instead was more subtle and more telling. A slight stillness that moved through her, the way stillness moves through someone who has just confirmed a variable they had already accounted for. How long have you had this number? 2 years. I haven't changed it. Maren looked at the screen again. Nobody from my military service has it. Somebody does now. Reeves handed the phone to Ede without looking away from Maren. Don't respond. Don't delete it. She turned toward the hallway. Pollen. Major Pollen materialized from somewhere to the left with the efficiency of someone who had been positioned rather than wandering. Reeves spoke to her in a low, clipped exchange that Maren caught pieces of. Trace it. Pull the tower data. See if we have anything on the building's external cameras from the last 20 minutes, and then Pollen was moving. And Reeves was turning back with the expression of someone recalibrating a timeline. We need to move faster than I planned, Reeves said. The drive. Reno. Not just the drive. I need you to write out a full account of Black Ridge Pass tonight. Everything you told me, upstairs in your own words, dated and signed. Before you leave this building, she paused. If someone in that building sent you that message, they know you've been talking to us. And they know what that means for them. Maren understood immediately. A text like that was not a warning from a friend. It was a message from someone who wanted her to run, to take the implied threat, and disappear before she could formalize anything, sign anything, put anything on record that could be used. It was the same logic that had worked 4 years ago. She was not 27 anymore. Where? She asked. Conference room on 3. I'll have someone with you. They moved. The hallway felt different now. The hospital's nighttime quiet reclassified from peaceful to exposed. Maren walked with Reeves to the stairwell, and as they passed the nursing station, she saw Dominic Fuertes at the desk, his head down over a chart, and she watched him not look up as she passed. He had heard things tonight. He had seen things. He was doing what Dominic did, which was keep his head down and wait to see which direction the wind settled before he committed to anything. She understood that. She still couldn't respect it. The conference room on 3 was small and adequately lit and smelled like old coffee and dry erase markers. A specialist whose name she wasn't given set a legal pad and 2 pens on the table in front of her, and Maren sat down and began to write. She had not written about Black Ridge Pass since the original field log, and the experience of doing it again was not what she expected. She had anticipated the difficulty of excavating it, the emotional weight of the specific and sensory details that lived in that memory, the way the particular quality of light in that valley had made everything look both sharper and more unreal at the same time. What she found instead was that the difficulty was practical. She was trying to reconstruct a sequence of events with medical precision while also locating at every moment that the official report had diverged from what she had actually done and documented. That required her to hold two versions of the same story in her head simultaneously, the true one and the one that had replaced it, and find every point of departure. She wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. When she was done, her hand was cramping, and the legal pad held 11 pages of close, careful writing that moved through the mission parameters, and the contact, and the CASIVAC window, and the decisions she had made with the information and resources available to her. And at the bottom of the last page, she wrote the date and signed her name and felt something she wasn't prepared to feel, which was the particular exhaustion of having told a true story for the first time in 4 years. Reeves read it while Maren sat across the table and drank water from a plastic cup and looked at the window and the parking lot below, where her cardboard box had been retrieved by someone. She could see it on the edge of the curb, sagging with water damage, the photograph of Tuck face down on the pavement beside it. "I'll have someone bring it up," Reeves said, without looking up from the pages. "It's fine." "The photograph." "It's fine," Maren said again. "It's a photograph. He's at home." Reeves turned a page. Reed turned another. When she finished, she set the pad down and looked at Maren with an expression that had shifted into something that was not the controlled professional neutrality of the consultation room. It was briefer than that, a flash of something genuine that came and went in the time it took Maren to register it. "There are 9 specific points in here that contradict the filed report," Reeves said. "Each one is documentable against the field records we've already pulled." She tapped the pad. "This isn't just your word against a report. This is your account aligning with the original field documentation that was excluded from the final version. Will that be enough? Combined with the drive from Reno?" "Yes." Reeves held her gaze. "It'll be enough." Maren nodded slowly. She was very tired. The kind of tired that lived below the level of sleep in the body's systems, and the particular ache of sustained tension finally releasing enough to make itself felt. She had been awake for 19 hours. She had flagged a patient twice, been formally terminated, saved a soldier twice, stood in a parking lot in the rain, been called by a name she hadn't heard in 4 years, given an 11-page deposition, and received a threat text from an unknown number. The night was not done yet. She knew that the way you knew weather was changing. Not from a single sign, but from the accumulation of pressure in the air around you. Reeves's phone rang. She answered it on the second ring, listened for 20 seconds without speaking, and then said, "Where?" and listened again. When she lowered the phone, her posture had changed in a way that was small and specific and unmistakable. "Brackett left the hospital 40 minutes ago," she said. "His car is in the lot. He didn't drive. We had someone watching the exit. He went out a side door on the ground floor that the cameras don't cover well. We have him on one frame, talking on his phone." Maren was already standing. She didn't know when she'd decided to stand. "He went out a side door at 3:52 a.m. after you told us you'd cooperate formally." Reeves was moving toward the door. "The specialist outside will stay with your statement." "I need you to come with me." "Why me?" Reeves looked back at her from the doorframe. "Because if Brackett knows something about what happened tonight that connects to Black Ridge Pass, you're the only person in this building who can tell me whether what he says makes sense from a clinical standpoint. And because," she paused, "you've earned the right to be in the room when this happens." They went down in the elevator. Ede was already in the lobby, and he and Reeves spoke in the abbreviated way they communicated, and then the three of them moved toward the ground floor corridor that led to the east wing. The administrative section, the billing offices, the rooms that were empty at 4 in the morning. They found Brackett in a supply coordinator's office on the ground floor east. He was standing behind the desk with his phone to his ear when Etta opened the door. In the 3 seconds between the door opening and Brackett processing what was happening were the most informative 3 seconds Maren had witnessed all night. His face moved through a sequence surprise, calculation, something that was almost recovery, and then the failure of recovery when he registered, who was standing behind the two military officers. He lowered the phone. "I'd like to call my attorney," he said. "You're not under arrest," Ede said. "We're having a conversation." "Then I'd like to call my attorney before having a conversation." "That's your right." Ede stood in the doorway without moving. "Who were you calling?" Brackett's jaw tightened. "That's also not something I'm required to share." "You left the hospital at 3:52 a.m. through a side exit, which is unusual behavior for an attending physician whose patient was transferred under military oversight less than an hour ago. We'd like to understand that." "I went for air for 30 minutes. I've had a difficult night." Maren stood behind Reeves and said nothing. She was watching Brackett the way she had always watched him, the way she watched anyone in a clinical space when she needed to understand what was actually happening rather than what the person wanted her to see. He was controlled. He was less controlled than he thought he was. There was a tightness around his eyes that wasn't anger and wasn't fatigue. It was the particular expression of someone running calculations and finding that the numbers were not resolving the way they needed to. He looked at Maren once, quickly. Then, away. For Brackett, Rive said, "We're going to ask you some questions about Harlow General's medical supply procurement relationships over the past 3 years. Specifically, contracts with a distribution company called Meridian Medical Solutions. You have the option to answer those questions here, now, voluntarily, or to come with us to a formal interview location where you will have the opportunity to have your attorney present. Either way, those questions are going to be answered." The name Meridian Medical Solutions did something to Brackett's face that he could not fully control. It was small. It was real. "I want my attorney," he said. "Understood." Reeves nodded to Ede. "We'll arrange transport." What happened in the next 10 minutes was procedural and quiet, and had the particular texture of machinery that had been built for exactly this moment and was now running the way it was designed to run. Maren stood in the hallway outside the coordinator's office while Eddie made calls, and Reeves spoke in low tones with Pollen, who had reappeared with the focused energy of someone who had been gathering information while everyone else was having conversations. Pollen handed Reeves a tablet. Reeves looked at it for a moment and then turned it toward Merriman. It was a photograph. Security camera footage, time-stamped, showing the east side exterior of the hospital. The quality was limited. The camera was positioned for the parking structure, not the side door. But the image was clear enough to show two people. One was Brackett. The other was a man she didn't recognize, heavyset, in a dark jacket, standing close enough that the conversation was private. "Do you know him?" Reeves asked. Maren studied the image. "No. His name is Walter Goss. He's a regional sales director for Meridian Medical Solutions." Reeves took the tablet back. "He's also the brother-in-law of retired Colonel Dennis Harwick." The name meant nothing to Maren. She said so. Dennis Harwick was the officer who signed the final incident report on Black Ridge Pass. Reeves said, "The version that named you." The hallway was very quiet. Maren stood with that information and let it arrange itself. The shape of it, the connections, the way something that had seemed like a single event 4 years ago was revealing itself to have roots that went sideways and down into territory she had never thought to look at because she hadn't known there was territory there. A colonel who had altered a field report, his brother-in-law in medical supply sales. A hospital department head who had been letting those sales contracts run while still systematically eliminating the staff members, Cumprins, who asked too many questions or noticed too many things. Brackett has been with Meridian. For how long? She asked. The first contract predates his appointment as department head by 8 months. Reeves looked at her steadily. He was recommended for the position by a member of the hospital board who had existing relationships with Meridian. What does this hospital buy from Meridian? Emergency department equipment. Monitors, ventilators, portable imaging units. Reeves paused. And single-use procedural supplies. Chest tubes. Needle decompression kits. Maren heard that land in the space between them and felt her thinking reorganize around it with a cold, methodical clarity that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the particular way her mind had always worked in a crisis, stripping the noise away and looking at what was actually there. "What's the failure rate on Meridian's equipment?" she asked. "That's what we're building the case around." Reeves's voice was careful. "We have 3 documented adverse events at Harlow General in the past 18 months that involved equipment failure during emergency procedures. In each case, the documentation listed user error or patient acuity as the contributing factor. Who documented them? The attending physician." Maren closed her eyes for half a second. She opened them. Brackett. Yes. She thought about the nurses who had worked in that department for years and filed their concerns and had those concerns written off as excessive escalation. She thought about herself and the 2 formal complaints, and the night Favre coded and Brackett had walked directly from the code to the nursing station to fill out a complaint against her. She thought about the way he had moved through the trauma bay when Vere arrived, the laryngoscope, the deliberate preparation for intubation on a patient whose presentation was screaming tension pneumo to anyone who looked at his neck. She thought about a needle decompression kit from a supply chain she had trusted without question. "Was the kit I used tonight?" She started. "Meridian sourced." "Yes." Reeves watched her. "It worked," which is its own kind of data point. "Because I was the one using it. Because you knew what you were doing, and you did it without hesitation. Equipment failure is most visible in the hands of someone who's rushing or uncertain." She paused. "Brackett has been documenting adverse events as user error for 18 months. We think some of those events were equipment failure. We think he's been covering it to protect the contract, to protect everything the contract connects to." Maren stood in the hallway and let the full shape of it settle. She was not a person who rushed her thinking when the thinking mattered. That was another thing the years had taught her, that the instinct to reach a conclusion quickly was sometimes the most dangerous instinct you had. She let the pieces stay in their positions and looked at the connections between them. A falsified incident report had ended her career. The officer who signed it had a brother-in-law in medical equipment sales. That brother-in-law had a relationship with a hospital department head who had been terminating staff and burying adverse events for 3 years. The soldier whose original field report, the true one, could have cleared her name had ended up on a trauma table after a training accident that was under review. And tonight, in the middle of all of it, she had been fired for the last time. Or possibly for the first time, in a way that was going to mean something. She became aware that Reeves was watching her with the particular attention of someone waiting to see how another person processed a large thing. "What do you need from me now?" Maren asked. "The drive from Reno. Your signed statement, which we have." And Reeves hesitated, which was the first time she had hesitated at anything, and Maren noticed it. "There's a nurse on your department, Dominic Fuertes. He's been here 8 years. He knows things," Maren said. "We believe he does. We also believe he's been afraid to say them." Reeves looked at her directly. "Would you be willing to talk to him? Before we do. It would be better coming from you. He watched me get fired tonight and said nothing." I know. Maren thought about Dominic at the nursing station, head down over his chart, the deliberate not looking up as she passed. She thought about the half-step he'd taken toward her in the hallway. When they walked her out, the way he'd said her name, like it was the beginning of a sentence he couldn't finish. "I'll talk to him," she said. "But not tonight. He needs a few hours with what he saw tonight before he's ready to say what he knows." Reeves nodded. "Tomorrow morning. Before 9. Before 9. Maren looked down the hallway toward the east wing, where Brackett was presumably waiting for his attorney in the supply coordinator's office, with the particular expression of a man confronting the limits of his own architecture. What happens to him tonight? He'll be questioned formally. His computer access to the hospital system has been restricted as of Reeves checked her watch 4 minutes ago. His personnel file is being pulled, and the state medical board has been notified that a formal inquiry is being opened. His patients are being reassigned to the covering physician. Dr. Brackett won't be treating patients at this facility for the foreseeable future. Maren nodded. She thought about Gerald Favre, asleep somewhere in this building, alive because she had paid attention to a monitor that Brackett had told her not to worry about. She thought about Favre's wife, who had been reached by the overnight social worker and had arrived at the hospital at 2:30 in the morning, and who was sitting somewhere right now in a waiting room chair with a paper cup of coffee, not knowing that the nurse who'd saved her husband's life had been fired 40 minutes before that husband's heart had given out. Some of the things that happened tonight were going to require a long time to untangle. That was just true. The elevator doors at the end of the hallway opened. Major Pollen stepped out, moving quickly, and she went directly to Reeves and said something that Maren couldn't hear at the distance. Reeves looked up. "When?" she said. Pollen answered. Reeves turned to Maren. Her expression had the quality of something recalibrating under pressure, not alarm, but the rapid adjustment of a plan meeting a new piece of information that changed the sequence. "The man in the photograph," she said. Walter Goss. "He was identified leaving the hospital parking lot 18 minutes ago." "You were watching him?" "We were watching the lot." Reeves was already moving. "He's not the problem. The problem is what Pollen just told me." She glanced back. "Goss made a call from the parking lot. We have it on the monitoring we've had in place. It's on his number for 6 weeks. He called Colonel Harwick, the retired one. He told him," she paused for a fraction of a second, "that the nurse had the drive." Maren went still. "I haven't told anyone about the drive except you and Ede and Pollen," she said. "In a closed room. Less than 2 hours ago." "Yes," Reeves said. The word sat there. Maren looked at Reeves. Reeves looked back at her with the steady expression of someone who had already moved past the implication and into the response, but who was giving Maren the 3 seconds she needed to arrive at the same place. "Someone's in that room," Maren said. "Or the room was compromised." Reeves started walking. "Either way, Harwick now knows the drive exists and that you're the one who has it. And Harwick," she pushed open the stairwell door, "is not a man who spent 20 years in military intelligence without knowing how to move quickly when his exposure changes." "What does that mean for the drive?" "It means the safe deposit box in Reno is no longer a secure location." Reeves was moving down the stairs with a speed that was controlled and purposeful. "It means we need to reach it before he does. The bank doesn't open until 9. We're not waiting for the bank." Reeves hit the ground floor landing and pushed through the door. "I have a federal warrant for the contents of that box. We can have the branch manager at the building in 40 minutes. She turned to look at Maren. "You're coming with us. You're the account holder. They'll need your identification." "My car is in the parking lot." "We're not taking your car." They came through the lobby at pace, Eddie falling in beside them from somewhere, the three of them moving with the coordinated efficiency of a plan that had shifted from deliberate to urgent. Through the lobby glass, Maren could see the military vehicles still positioned in the lot, rain-wet and yellow under the sodium lights. She grabbed her jacket from the chair where she'd left it hours ago. She had her ID. She had her phone, with 3 words on it from an unknown number. She had 11 pages of signed testimony on a legal pad 3 floors above her, and a flash drive in a bank in Reno that someone was now moving to intercept. She had spent 4 years being quiet about all of it. She was done being quiet. They were through the lobby doors and into the rain when her phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. This time not 3 words. A photograph. She stopped walking for 2 steps, just 2, and looked at the image on her screen. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing, and then it took her another moment to understand what it meant. And when both of those moments had passed, she looked up at Reeves with something in her face that was past, the careful steadiness she'd been maintaining all night. The photograph was of the inside of a bank, the safe deposit room. Taken within the last hour, based on the timestamp embedded in the image data. She could see the box number on the frame in the background. Her box number. Someone had already been inside. Reeves took the phone from Maren's hand and looked at the photograph for 4 seconds. Then she turned to Ede and said, "Get Reno Field on the line now. I need someone at First Western Bank on Calder Street before anyone else goes in or out of that building." Sai. Ede already had his phone out. Maren stood in the rain outside the hospital entrance and looked at the image again over Reeves's shoulder. The timestamp embedded in the photograph metadata read 4:11 a.m. It was currently 4:23 a.m. 12 minutes. Whatever had happened inside that bank had happened 12 minutes ago, which meant someone had moved on the safe deposit box within an hour of her mentioning it to Reeves in a closed consultation room on the 3rd floor of Harlow General. The mathematics of that were ugly and specific. How many people knew about that room on 3? Maren asked. 6. Reeves was still looking at the phone. Ede, Paulin, myself, the specialist who brought you the legal pad, and 2 people running external coordination. She handed the phone back. None of them sent this photograph. Then the room was compromised. Yes, listening device, or a phone relay. Reeves turned to face the parking lot. Either way, someone had coverage in that room and moved the moment you gave them something actionable. She looked at Maren directly. The photograph was sent to you deliberately. Whoever did this wants you to know the drive is gone. They want you to believe that everything you signed tonight is now unsupported. Is it? No. Reeves said it without hesitation. Your signed account aligns with field documentation we already hold independently. The drive strengthens the case. It doesn't build the foundation. She paused. But they don't know what we already have. And that means they just made an error. Maren absorbed that. The rain was coming down lighter. Now the heavy part of the storm, having passed somewhere in the last hour, leaving behind the fine, persistent drizzle that soaked slowly through everything. She was cold in a way she hadn't been aware of until this moment, the sustained cold of someone who had been wet for 2 hours and running too fast on adrenaline to register it. The photograph itself, she said. They sent it from an unknown number to show me the box. But to take it, they had to be inside the bank. At 4 a.m, she looked at Reeves. How do you get inside a federal depository institution in the middle of the night without triggering alarms? Reeves's expression sharpened. You don't. Not without either disabling the system or having credentials that allow access. She was already turning back toward Ede. Tell Reno Field to pull the entry logs for the last 3 hours. I want to know whose credentials opened that building. Ede relayed it. They moved to the military vehicle at the front of the lot, a dark SUV, not marked, with a driver, already, behind the wheel, who had the particular stillness of someone who had been waiting with the engine running. Maren got in the back, Reeves beside her, Ede in front. The vehicle was moving before the doors were fully closed. The drive to the highway was quiet in the way that operational silence was quiet. Not empty, but compressed. Everyone in the vehicle processing and preparing rather than filling space with words. Maren watched Denton slide past the rain-streaked window, the empty streets and gas stations, and the particular flatness of a Nevada city at 4:30 in the morning, and she thought about the drive. What was on it, what it had cost her to keep it, and what it had cost her not to use it. She had made a copy. That was the thing she had not told Reeves in the consultation room. Not because she was withholding it strategically, but because the conversation had moved at a pace that hadn't created a natural place to say it. 3 years ago, when she'd made the decision to put the original drive in the safe deposit box, she had also made a second copy and stored it differently. Not in a bank. not in a fixed location at all. She had sent it to an email address, an anonymous one she'd created for exactly this purpose, attached to a draft that was never sent, sitting in the unsent folder of an account she logged into once a year to confirm it still existed. The email address was in her head. The password was in her head. No device, no paper, no physical object that anyone could photograph or steal. She looked at the back of Ede's headrest and decided that now was a good time to say so. "I have a backup," she said. Reeves turned to look at her. A copy of the drive, digital, stored in an unsent email draft on an anonymous account. "I can access it from any browser." She held Reeves's gaze. "I didn't mention it earlier because it didn't seem necessary. It seems necessary now." Reeves was quiet for a moment. "When did you make the copy?" 3 years ago. Same time I put the original in the box." "And you've maintained access?" "I check it every October." "The account is still active." Reeves looked at her for another beat. And in that beat, Maren could see things that is competing in her expression. The professional assessment of someone recalibrating the situation, and something more personal, which was the recognition of a specific kind of thinking. The planning of someone who had known, at some level, even at 28 years old, in a Nevada apartment with a rescue dog and a nursing license, and a set of memories she was trying to bury, that this day was eventually going to arrive. "You planned for this," Reeves said. Not an accusation. Not exactly admiration. Something between the two. "I planned for the possibility that I might someday need to be able to prove what I knew without relying on a physical object that could be taken from me." Maren looked out the window. "I was a medic. We planned for contingencies." Ede made a sound from the front seat that was not quite a laugh. Reeves said, "We're going to need you to access that account." "I know. I'll need a secure browser and a private connection." "We have both." Reeves looked at the road ahead. "This changes the calculus significantly." "How significantly?" "Whoever took that drive or photographed that box, or both, is operating on the assumption that they've removed your primary evidence, which means they're going to make decisions in the next few hours based on that assumption." She turned back to Maren. "And every decision they make on a false premise is a decision that tells us more about who they are and how they're connected." It was 41 minutes to Reno on the highway, and they covered it in 34. The vehicle moved with the quiet authority of something that did not worry about speed limits, and Maren used the time to go through the email account in her head. The sequence of the password, the name of the draft file, the specific contents of what was stored there. She had looked at it last October, 8 months ago, sitting at her kitchen table, with Tuck's head on her foot and a cup of coffee going cold beside her laptop, and she had confirmed it was intact, and then closed the browser and gone to work. She had not let herself read it, just confirmed it was there. The bank was a 2-story building on Calder Street in Reno's financial district, modest in the way that depository institutions were modest, functional, secure, unmemorable. 2 Reno field agents were already positioned at the entrance when their vehicle pulled up, and a third was with the branch manager, a thin man in his 50s named Oral Whitaker, who had the expression of someone roused from sleep by a federal warrant and was working hard to be cooperative despite the hour. The entry logs told the story quickly. The security system showed a credential X at 3:58 a.m. A keycard registered to a facility maintenance contractor with a service agreement that gave overnight access for equipment checks. The contractor's name on the agreement was a company called Reliant Services LLC. The agent running the check had the parent company within 4 minutes. Reliant Services LLC was registered to an address in Phoenix, Arizona, with a registered agent whose name Maren didn't recognize. But Reeves did. "Harold Finch," Reeves said. "He's Harwick's attorney. Has been for 11 years. Ede said something sharp and low. "So Harwick's attorney's company has a service contract with a federal bank in Reno," Maren said. "One of 6 banks in the region with the same contract." Reeves looked at the screen the agent was showing her. "This isn't improvised." This was in place before tonight. The implication was cold and specific. The access to the bank had been arranged in advance. Not after Maren mentioned the drive in the consultation room before, which meant either someone had known about the drive for longer than tonight, or the infrastructure had been positioned as a precaution, a contingency plan for the possibility that the Black Ridge Pass investigation ever progressed far enough to reach the person who had been present at the scene. Maren had been present at the scene. They had built a mechanism to reach her records before she could use them. The branch manager led them to the safe deposit room. Maren's box number 447, which she had chosen because it was in the back row, and the reference number was easy to remember, was intact, locked, undisturbed in its exterior appearance. She used her key and the branch manager's override key and opened it. The drive was inside. She picked it up and held it in her palm and looked at it. It was a standard USB drive in a waterproof case. She had bought it at a hardware store in Denton 3 years ago, specifically because it was unremarkable. She turned it over once. Whoever was here, she said, didn't take it. Reeves leaned in, looked at the drive, looked at the empty box around it. They photographed it. Why photograph it and leave it? Because taking it is a federal crime with a clear evidentiary chain. Reeves straightened. Photographing it and sending the image to you achieves the same psychological objective without the criminal exposure. She looked at Maren. They wanted you to believe it was gone without actually committing the act of taking it. They wanted me to run or to fold, to decide that whatever you'd signed tonight was now unprotected, and that the cost of continuing was higher than the cost of going quiet. Reeves paused. The same logic that worked 4 years ago. Maren closed her hand around the drive. She handed it to Reeves. Then she took out her phone and navigated to the browser and pulled up the anonymous email account from memory 12 keystrokes, a password she had chosen because it referenced specific reading on a field monitor during a CASVAC. In a valley she was trying not to name out loud and found the unsent draft in the folder where she had left it and turned the screen toward Reeves. Both copies are now in your possession, she said. Do what you need to do. They returned to Denton in a gray pre-dawn that was not quite light but was no longer fully dark, the sky doing the uncertain thing it did in Nevada between night and morning, where the color was neither black nor blue, but something unresolved. Maren's sat in the back of the vehicle and let herself be still for the first time in hours. Not asleep, she was past the point where she could have slept, but still, which was different. Reeves was on the phone for most of the return drive. Maren caught pieces of it. The state medical board. A federal prosecutor's office in Las Vegas. Something about Fort Hauser that she didn't have the full context to interpret. Reeves's voice was even throughout the same controlled register she had maintained since the doorway of the trauma bay, with occasional moments where it compressed slightly, which Maren had begun to read as the vocal equivalent of someone tightening their grip. They reached Harlow General at 6:14 a.m. The morning shift was beginning to arrive, cars pulling into the lot, nurses in scrubs crossing from the parking structure, the particular rhythm of an institution transitioning from its nighttime skeleton crew to its daytime operation. Maren watched the familiar faces from the window of the vehicle. People she had worked alongside for years, arriving for a shift that would start with the news that Owen Brackett was not there and was not coming, that there was a federal inquiry underway, that the overnight ER had been something other than an ordinary overnight ER. Dominic Fuertes arrived at 6:22 a.m. Maren saw him from the vehicle, his gray Toyota, pulling into his usual spot, the third row from the entrance, the spot he'd been using for 8 years. He got out with his coffee thermos and his badge lanyard and stopped when he saw the military vehicle still positioned at the entrance. He stood there for a moment, reading the scene the way a person read a scene, when they understood that something significant had happened and were trying to determine the scope before they walked into it. Maren got out of the vehicle. He saw her across the lot. 30 feet of wet pavement between them. He didn't move. She walked toward him. When she reached him, she stopped. He looked at her wet clothes, her cardboard box, which someone had retrieved from the curb and left on the hood of the vehicle she'd arrived in, at the military personnel visible through the lobby glass behind her. He looked at all of it and then at her face, and something in his expression moved toward the sentence call started in the hallway 6 hours ago and not finished. Maren, he said. I know, she said. You were scared. His jaw worked. He was a 53-year-old charge nurse who had been at this hospital longer than most of the physicians who outranked him, and he looked, in this moment, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that the weight had become part of his posture. I knew he was wrong about Favre, he said. I knew when you flagged the first time. I know you did. I have a mortgage. 2 kids finishing college. I know that too. He looked at the ground, then up. What's happening? A lot. And it's going to require people who were in that department to talk about what they saw. She kept her voice even. There are federal investigators side who are going to want your account of the last 18 months. Not just tonight. All of it. His face moved through something complicated. What happens if I don't know exactly. That's honest. She looked at him. What I know is that the people who made it expensive to say the right thing are not going to be in a position to make it expensive much longer. He was quiet for a moment. The morning light was strengthening around them, pale and still wet, but definitely morning now. Is Brackett? He's with federal investigators. She paused. He's been there since 4:30. Dominic exhaled through his nose. It was a long exhale, the kind that had more than air in it. Okay, he said. Okay. He walked toward the entrance. Maren watched him go and then turned back to the vehicle where Reeves was waiting with her phone at her ear and the expression of someone managing multiple threads simultaneously. The morning was arriving whether anyone was ready for it or not. What followed was not cinematic. That procedural. That was the thing about real processes, slow and full of waiting in rooms where the coffee was bad. Maren sat in a conference room on the second floor for 3 hours. While things happened around her and adjacent to her and in offices she was not in. Reeves came and went. Ede came and went. A federal prosecutor named Sasha Wren arrived at 8:45 a.m. and spoke with Maren for 40 minutes about her statement, the drive, the backup copy, and the timeline of events as she understood them. Wren was younger than Maren, expected early 40s. Sharp, in the way of someone who had been underestimated enough times to have developed a particular relationship with precision. And she asked her questions without the careful hedging that Maren had expected, which was either a good sign or a sign that the case was already further along than she understood. At 9:17 a.m., Reeves came into the conference room and sat down across from Maren without preamble. Brackett talked, she said. Maren looked at her. Not everything. His attorney arrived at 7:15 and has been managing the scope carefully. But enough. Reeves folded her hands on the table. He confirmed the Meridian relationship. He confirmed that the contracts were arranged through a referral from the board member, and that he had been aware the board member had existing relationships with Harwick's network. He is claiming that his involvement was limited to the procurement side and that he had no knowledge of the Black Ridge Pass alteration. Do you believe him? It's plausible that the procurement fraud and the report alteration were compartmentalized. Harwick is careful. He wouldn't have given Brackett more information than Brackett needed to do what Brackett was supposed to do. She paused. But Brackett knew that the nurses who were filing concerns were inconvenient to the arrangement. And he addressed that inconvenience systematically. By writing them up, by documenting adverse events as user error, by maintaining an environment where questioning his decisions was professionally costly. Reeves looked at her steadily. He knew what he was protecting, even if he didn't know all of what it connected to. and the accident at Fort Hauser. Sergeant Vere, still under investigation. What we know is that Vere had made formal inquiries to the Army Records Command twice in the last year about the Black Ridge Pass incident file. Those inquiries were logged. Someone with access to that log would have known he was looking. Reeves's voice remained level. We're treating the accident as suspicious pending the outcome of the physical evidence review. Maren sat with that. The coffee in the room was bad. She drank it anyway. She had not eaten 12 hours, and the coffee was doing something functional at least. "What about Harwick?" she asked. "That's the part I need to tell you carefully." Reeves straightened. Dennis Harwick retained counsel at 6 this morning. A firm in Washington, D.C. with a specific practice area in military legal defense. She paused. "He's also filed a preemptive civil suit against you." The room was quiet. "Against me," Maren said. "Against you and against the DEI and against the Army Special Operations Command Medical Oversight Division." Reeves said it without inflection, which was its own kind of thing. His position, as stated in the filing, is that the investigation into the Black Ridge Pass report is a retaliatory action driven by a disgruntled former service member who falsified original field documentation to avoid accountability for a medical failure. Maren looked at the surface of the table, the particular flat beige of a conference table that had absorbed 1,000 difficult conversations. "He's claiming I falsified the field log," she said. "Yes, the field log that's been in a bank in Reno for 3 years, in an account he only learned about 8 hours ago. His filing was submitted at 6 a.m., Reeves said, 2 hours after Goss's call to him from the parking lot. The preparation for that filing predates tonight significantly." She held Maren's gaze. "Which tells us that Harwick has had a contingency plan in place for some time. A lawsuit framework built and ready to deploy the moment this investigation reached him. He's been waiting for this. He's been preparing for it." Reeves reached into the folder she'd brought in and set a single page on the table. "Which is why this matters." Maren looked at the page. It was a document she didn't immediately recognize, technical, formatted, with a header she had to read twice. "Fort Hauser Training Command, Incident Review Board, Preliminary Findings." She read it. It was brief, 4 paragraphs. The language was dense with bureaucratic caution, in the way that preliminary findings always were, every conclusion hedged with pending and subject to. But the core of it was there in the second paragraph, where the review board had documented their initial assessment of the training accident that had put Sergeant Dylan Vere on a trauma table in Denton, Nevada. The drill had been modified. Not on the official training schedule informally, a last-minute change to the exercise parameters that had been communicated verbally rather than through the written order system. The modification had placed Vere in a position that was not part of his assigned role in the drill, a position that significantly increased his exposure to the specific mechanism of injury he had sustained. The modification had been requested by a senior officer. The senior officer's name was in the document. She looked up at Reeves. "Harwick's son-in-law, say," Reeves said, before she could ask. "Assigned to Fort Hauser 6 months ago. Training command. Enough authority to adjust exercise parameters without generating a written record." She paused. "He submitted his resignation from the Army this morning at 700. Maren set the page down. "He tried to kill Vere," she said. "The review board is not using that language yet. They're using language about unauthorized exercise modifications and gross negligence." Reeves retrieved the page. "But the outcome they were engineering is not ambiguous. Because Vere's field report, the real one, would have been enough to reopen the entire Black Ridge Pass record. And because Vere had been making formal inquiries, he was on the record as looking. Getting rid of the document doesn't help if the man who wrote it is still making noise." She paused. "Harwick made an error. He acted on a threat he'd been managing quietly for 18 months, and he acted in a way that created a physical trail in a controlled military environment with its own oversight structure. He underestimated how much attention a training accident would get. He underestimated what kind of attention it would get when the man who was injured ended up in a civilian hospital, where a nurse with a classified history happened to be on shift. Not happened. Nothing about tonight had been incidental. But Maren understood what Reeves meant. "What comes next?" Maren asked. "The civil suit goes through the courts, which will take time. But the evidentiary foundation Harwick is claiming doesn't exist. The falsified documentation is going to be very difficult to argue when the federal case is built around independent records that corroborate your account." Reeves closed the folder. His own lawsuit is going to become the mechanism by which the full Blackridge Pass record enters the public legal process. He sued me and built the case against himself. He sued you because he thought you had nothing left to support your account. He was wrong. Reeves stood. The medical board formally opened its inquiry into Owen Brackett at 8:30 this morning. His hospital access has been suspended. His patient assignments have been redistributed. The board will take the time it takes, but the documentation we've provided them, including the adverse event records and Dominic Fuertes' preliminary statement, which he gave voluntarily at 7:45, gives them significant material to work with. Maren looked up. Dominic gave a statement. He did. 2 hours ago. Reeves allowed herself something that was not quite a smile, but occupied similar territory. He asked that I tell you. Maren nodded once. She thought about Dominic standing in the lot in the gray morning light, saying okay the way people said it when they had finally decided that the cost of staying quiet had exceeded the cost of speaking. People arrived at that calculation at different speeds. The important thing was that they arrived. Your termination from this facility, Reeves said. Hospital administration has been informed of the circumstances of tonight's events and the ongoing investigations. The chief of medicine, not Brackett, the actual administrative chief, has been notified that your termination was executed by a department head under federal investigation, using a disciplinary process that is now subject to review. That doesn't automatically reinstate me. No, it initiates a review process that will. Reeves paused. Unless you don't want it to. Maren looked at her. You have options that you didn't have at 2:30. This morning, Reeves said. Cedar Harlow General is one of them. There are others. She picked up her folder. I want you to think about what you actually want, not just what you're responding to. She moved toward the door. You have time now. This is going to take months to fully resolve. Take a few days. Sleep. See your dog. She was at the door when Maren said, the Blackridge Pass record. When does it get corrected? Reeves turned. The formal correction of the record requires the completion of the federal investigation and a determination by the Army Records Command that the filed report contains documented inaccuracies. She held Maren's gaze. Based on what we have, the field documentation, your signed account, the backup copy of the drive, and the corroborating testimony from personnel who were present at Fort Hauser, I expect that determination to be made. She paused. I expect your record to be corrected. How long? 4 to 6 months, possibly less, depending on how quickly Harwick's defense consolidates. She paused again. One more thing. She came back from the door and set a single card on the table. Sergeant Vare is stable. He was transferred to the military medical facility in Carson City. He was extubated this morning, and he's conscious. She paused. He asked whether you were still at the hospital. Maren looked at the card, an internal military contact number. He can call when he's ready, Reeves said. That number will reach you. She left. Maren sat alone in the conference room with the bad coffee and the pale morning coming through the window and the card on the table, and she was very still in the way that people were still when they had passed through something enormous and come out the other side into the quiet that followed, which was not peace exactly, but was the absence of the immediate danger, which sometimes felt close enough. She thought about Harwick's civil suit, his attorney in Washington, the carefully constructed framework he had built and held in reserve waiting to deploy it the moment this investigation moved toward him. A man who had spent 20 years in military intelligence building contingencies and who had responded to tonight's events by filing a lawsuit that named her as the aggressor. She thought about what Reeves had said. His lawsuit is going to become the mechanism by which the full Blackridge Pass record enters the public legal process. She thought about the irony of it, and the irony was not satisfying in the way that irony was sometimes satisfying. It was just what it was. A man had spent 4 years protecting himself from the consequences of what he had done, and in protecting himself, he had made the series of decisions that had brought everything into the open in a way that a quieter approach might never have. Her phone buzzed, the unknown number again. She expected another message. Another photograph. Another 3-word attempt to make her feel like the ground was gone. She looked at the screen. The number was blocked. The text was one line. The board will hear about this. All of it. Your career is done regardless. She set the phone down on the table. She looked at the window. It's the morning outside. She picked up the phone again. She picked up the to the number Reeves had given her 2 hours ago, and then she set it back down, and then she sat up for another moment in the quiet. Then she stood, picked up Reeves's card, and walked to the door. In the hallway outside, a hospital administrator she didn't recognize was walking toward her with the expression of someone who had been briefed on a situation and was approaching it with significant uncertainty about the protocol. Behind him, at the nursing station, she could see 2 nurses from the day shift who had recognized her and were recognized or watching with an attention they weren't bothering to conceal. The administrator reached her and stopped. "Miss Coyle," he said. "I'm Robert Haas, Assistant Chief of Medicine. We wanted to, he stopped. Started again. "We owe you an apology for last night." She looked at him. He was uncomfortable. He should be. "That's the start," she said. He opened his mouth to continue, and whatever he was going to say next was interrupted by the sound of a commotion at the far end of the hallway. Raised voices, a door opening hard, the specific noise of something happening that had not been planned. She looked toward it. Owen Brackett was being walked out of a conference room by 2 federal agents. His attorney was 3 steps behind, speaking loudly about procedure and rights and the terms of cooperation, and Brackett himself was walking with the careful posture of someone maintaining the last exterior scaffolding of a structure that had already collapsed internally. He passed within 10 feet of her. He looked at her once. The way he had looked at her across every argument they had ever had, with the certainty of a man who believed his authority was structural, permanent, built into the architecture of the world rather than granted by the specific circumstances that were currently evaporating around him. This time, she held his gaze until he looked away first. And in the conference room beyond him, through the open door that one of the agents hadn't yet closed, she could see a laptop screen, an open file, a name at the top of a document she was too far away to read in full. She caught one word: Blackridge. She stood in that hallway and looked at the word on the screen through the open door until one of the agents pulled the door shut from the inside, and then it was just a closed door like any other closed door in any other hospital corridor. And the administrator beside her was still talking about apologies and review processes and the hospital's commitment to due process. And she let him finish because he was going to finish regardless. "Thank you, Mr. Haas," she said when he was done. She walked to the elevator. She went home. She needed a shower and clean clothes and 4 hours of sleep and her dog, in that order. And she was going to get all of them before she did anything else, because the work that remained was going to require her to be functional, and functioning required the basics. And the basics had been deferred for approximately 8 hours longer than was sustainable. The cardboard box was in the back of a military vehicle somewhere in the hospital parking lot, and she did not go back for it. The coffee mug with the chipped handle had made it through worse than a Nevada rainstorm. It would survive wherever it ended up. Tuck was at the door when she came in, the full-body enthusiasm of a German shepherd who had been alone since sevens the previous evening and had thoughts about that. She sat on the floor of her entryway in her wet clothes and let him climb on her, his paws on her shoulders, his nose at her ear, making the specific sounds he made when he was communicating a grievance and a welcome something simultaneously. And she put her arms around him and pressed her face into the side of his neck and stayed there. She stayed there for a while. When she got up, she was still tired, but she was steadier, and that was all she needed. She slept 4 hours and woke at 2 in the afternoon to 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize and 1 from Reeves. She called Reeves first. The Army Records Command received the formal submission this morning, Reeves said. The field documentation, your account, the drive contents. Their review process typically takes 8 to 12 weeks, but there's been a request for expedited review given that an active federal investigation is running concurrent. Matt, how expedited? They're targeting 30 days. A pause. I've seen them move faster when they want to. Maren sat on the edge of her bed with Tuck pressed against her legs. Through the window, Denton was doing what Denton did on a gray November afternoon, flat and windswept, and entirely indifferent to the previous night. What about Harwick's civil suit? Filed in federal district court in D.C. His attorney is Marcus Toll. You won't know him, but he's handled a specific category of military legal defense for 20 years. He's good. Reeves said it without editorializing. But the suit is built on the claim that the field documentation was falsified by you, and the federal case is being built on independent, corroborating records that predate any involvement you had with the investigation. His argument has a foundational problem, and Toll is smart enough to know it. He filed it anyway, because filing it publicly puts you on the defensive. It's in the news cycle now. 2 outlets picked it up this morning. A retired colonel suing a fired nurse, and the DIA for retaliation. Reeves's voice was measured. That framing lasts about 48 hours before the counter-narrative arrives. What's the counter-narrative? The accurate one, which is being prepared. She paused. Sasha Wren's office is coordinating with Army Public Affairs. There will be a statement. It will be specific. Maren thought about her name in a news cycle. She had spent 4 years making sure her name wasn't in any cycle at all, and now it was going to be in one, whether she arranged it or not. So the only remaining question was which version of the story arrived first. The medical board, she said. Bracket. Formal inquiry is active. His hospital privileges at Harlow General are suspended pending outcome. The board has received the adverse event documentation, the procurement records, and Dominic Fortes' statement, which has been corroborated by 2 additional nurses who came forward this morning. Reeves paused. A third nurse-woman named Adele Pruitt, who left the department 14 months ago, contacted the board directly after seeing Brackett's name in this morning's coverage. She has documentation of her own. Maren didn't know Adele Pruitt. She had arrived after Maren's time. But she knew the nurses who left because the cost of staying had become too high, who walked away from jobs they were good at because the environment made being good at them impossible. She thought about how many of them there were, not just at Harlow General. Everywhere that a version of Owen Brackett had been allowed to operate unchecked because he generated revenue and kept his complaints formal and his authority unquestioned. What does he say? Maren asked. Brackett. That he made procurement decisions in good faith based on vendor representations and board-level referrals. That his documentation of adverse events reflected his clinical assessment at the time. That the terminations and write-ups were legitimate administrative actions within his authority. Reeves's voice was even. He's not claiming innocence. He's claiming ignorance of the larger picture and the lawsuit against me, Harwick naming me specifically, is going to cost him. Reeves said it with a flatness that carried weight, because the discovery process that follows a civil suit runs both directions. And Harwick's legal team is going to spend the next several months explaining why a retired colonel with connections to a medical supply fraud scheme, and a suspicious training accident and an altered military incident report, chose to sue a nurse. Maren looked at Tuck, who was watching her with the patient attention of a dog, who understood that something significant had happened to his person and was available for whatever came next. 30 days, she said, for the Army Records Command. Targeting 30. I'll call you when we have confirmation of the timeline. She put the phone down and sat for a while with the afternoon light coming through the window and the city outside being ordinary, and she let herself exist in the ordinary of it for a few minutes, which was something she had not let herself fully do in a long time. She went back to work on the 32nd day, not at Harlow General. Not yet. The administrative review of her termination was still moving through its process, which was going to take the time it took, regardless of what she wanted, and she had discovered in the intervening weeks that she was not sure what she wanted regarding Harlow General, which was its own kind of information. She picked up per diem shifts at a smaller facility, 20 minutes east of Community Hospital, called Prentice Valley Medical, understaffed and unglamorous and full of the kind of patients who fell through the gaps of the larger system. She worked nights. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. The Army Records Command issued its determination on day 31. Reeves called her at 7:43 a.m. on a Wednesday in December, while she was in her car in the Prentice Valley parking lot after the end of a 12-hour shift, still in her scrubs, with a coffee she hadn't touched, yet going cold in the cup holder. The determination has been issued, Reeves said. The Army Records Command has found that the filed incident report for the Black Ridge Pass event contains documented inaccuracies inconsistent with the original field records and the independent corroborating evidence submitted. The report has been officially amended. A pause. Your record has been corrected, Maren. She looked through the windshield at the parking lot. Stone. A maintenance worker was collecting a stray cart near the entrance. The sky was the particular pale gray of a Nevada December morning. Not dramatic, not beautiful, just a morning. Okay, she said. Is that all you've got? I'm tired. I worked all night. Reeves made a sound that was, finally, an actual laugh, brief and real. The amended record will be reflected in your official service documentation within 2 weeks. The combat medical badge and your commendation from the first deployment are already confirmed as restored to your file. She paused. The family of the operator who died at Black Ridge Pass has been notified of the corrected findings. They've been informed that his death resulted from injuries sustained during initial contact that were non-survivable, and that the medical care provided during the CASVAC was appropriate and correctly executed. Maren closed her eyes. She had thought about that family more times in 4 years than she could count. Not with guilt, exactly. She had known what she had done and why, and the knowing had never changed. But with the particular weight of people who had been told a wrong thing and believed it, and who had grieved something partly built on a lie, and who had not known that was what they were doing. How did they respond? She asked. The mother asked who the medic was. Reeves's voice was careful. I told her your name. She said she'd like to write to you, if you're open to it. I'm open to it. I'll pass that on. She sat in the parking lot until the coffee was completely cold, and then she drove home and slept for 6 hours and woke up feeling like something had shifted in the architecture of her chest. Not dramatically, not the catharsis that movies promised, just a small structural change, a weight distributed into a position that was more sustainable. Dennis Hark's civil suit reached its first major procedural hearing in January. Maren was not in the courtroom. She was at Prentice Valley working a day shift when Reeves texted her the outcome 3 words, economical as everything Reeves communicated, motion to dismiss. Granted. The federal district judge had found that the suit lacked the evidentiary foundation to proceed, specifically that the claim of falsified documentation was unsupported in the face of the independent field records that the DIA had submitted as part of the discovery process. Harwick's attorney had argued strenuously. The judge had not been moved. Harwick appealed. The appeal took 11 weeks and failed. By the time the appellate decision came down in March, the federal criminal investigation into the procurement fraud had produced its first indictments. Walter Goss, the Meridian Regional Sales Director, pled guilty to conspiracy to fraud and was cooperating with prosecutors. The board member who had recommended Brackett for his position, a man named Gordon Fells, who had been on the Harlow General Board for 9 years, was indicted on 4 counts, including wire fraud and conspiracy. Harwick himself was indicted in February on charges that included conspiracy to obstruct military justice, filing a fraudulent official record, and conspiracy to commit assault related to the training accident that had put Dylan Vare in a trauma bay in Denton. His son-in-law, who had resigned his commission the morning after the accident, reached a plea agreement in exchange for cooperation and received a sentence that was, by most assessments, insufficient. That was the nature of plea agreements. They were transactions, not justice, though they were sometimes the closest available approximation. Harwick did not take a plea. He went to trial in the fall, and the trial lasted 3 weeks, and on the 19th day, the jury returned a verdict on all counts. Maren was not in the courtroom for the verdict either. She had been asked if she wanted to be, and she had thought about it and decided that she didn't need to be, that the verdict was going to be what it was regardless of whether she was sitting in a gallery watching it happen, and that needing to witness it was a kind of dependence on the outcome that Tracy was trying to move past rather than toward. Reeves called her when it came in. "Guilty," she said. "All counts." "Okay," Maren said. "You're going to need a different word eventually." "It's a good word. It means what I need it to mean." Owen Brackett's medical board hearing concluded in April. The findings were released publicly documented pattern of professional misconduct, repeated failure to act on clinical warnings from nursing staff, falsification of adverse event documentation, and a pattern of retaliatory administrative actions against staff members who raised legitimate safety concerns. His medical license was revoked. The revocation was permanent. He would not practice medicine again in Nevada or any reciprocal state. The hospital issued a public statement. It was carefully worded in the way of institutional statements acknowledging failures without fully naming the humans who had enabled them, expressing commitment to reform without fully accounting for the years in which reform had been unnecessary because the complaints being filed were being absorbed and neutralized by the department head. Maren read the statement once and did not read it again. Institution said what institution said. What mattered was what they did, and what Harlow General did in the months that followed was implement a reporting structure that bypassed department heads for nursing safety concerns, bring in an external review of the adverse event documentation from Brackett's tenure, and reach out to the nurses who had left the department in the previous 3 years to review the circumstances of their departures. Adele Pruitt came back. Not to the ER, she had moved into pediatric nursing and was not going back, but she came back to the building, to the nursing director's office, and she gave a formal account of everything she had documented and not known what to do with when she left. Maren heard about this secondhand from Dominic, who had become the kind of person in the intervening months who called her occasionally with updates, not out of guilt exactly, but out of the specific loyalty of someone who had made a choice late and was now trying to ensure that the choice meant something. She had notes, Dominic told her. Adele, going back 2 years. She'd been keeping records on her own because she thought someday someone would want them. Smart, Maren said. Yeah, a pause, like someone else I know. The call from Dylan Vare, a Tuesday afternoon in February, 4 months after the night in the trauma bay. Maren was at home, off shift, sitting at the kitchen table with Tuck and a case study she was reviewing for a continuing education credit. The number on the screen was the military contact Reeves had left for her in December. This is Vare, he said. Sergeant Dylan Vare. You probably don't. I mean, you were there, so you know who I am. I know who you are. A pause. He had the slightly awkward directness of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say, and then decided in the moment that the rehearsed version was worse than the unrehabilitated one. I wanted to call. I should have called sooner. You were recovering, she said. It takes time. Still, you kept breathing twice in like 40 minutes. That's... He stopped. I don't know what the right thing to say about that is. You don't have to say anything about it. I wanted to say thank you. You're welcome. A pause. She could hear him working through the next part, the part that was harder than thank you. The record, he said. Your record. I heard it was corrected. It was. I should have, when I found out what the filed report said, I should have pushed harder. I filed the inquiry twice, and when it went nowhere, he stopped again. I should have pushed harder. She thought about what to say to that and settled on the truth. You were a 23-year-old specialist who filed a formal inquiry challenging a colonel's signed report. Twice. Most people don't do it once. She paused. You did what you could with what you had. It wasn't enough. No, but it was something, and it was part of what made the rest of it possible. She meant that. The inquiry logs, showing that Vare had formally questioned the record, had been part of what Reeves's team had used to establish the pattern of suppression. His questions had not been answered, but they had been logged, and the logging had mattered. They tell me your record's been corrected, he said again. Your medical record. From Blackridge. Yes. Good. He said it simply, and with a weight that she understood was doing a lot of work. Yeah. Good. They talked for 20 more minutes about things that were not Blackridge past his recovery, which was going well enough that he was looking at a return to limited duty in the spring, her work at Prentice Valley, which she described accurately as unglamorous and necessary, his dog, a Belgian Malinois named Rook, who had apparently staged a one-animal protest of his extended hospital absence by refusing to sleep anywhere except directly in front of the door. She told him about Tuck, who at that moment was asleep on her feet under the kitchen table, dreaming something that made his paws move. When they hung up, she sat for a moment with the phone on the table and the afternoon coming through the window and Tuck's warmth on her feet, and she thought about Dylan Vare in a valley 4 years ago. A PFC who had written down what he saw because that was what you were supposed to do, and what it had cost him, and what he had tried to do about it anyway. She thought about how small that act had seemed at the time. One junior soldier's field notes, one formal inquiry that went nowhere, one name on a log that someone would look at years later and understand as evidence of something that had been deliberately buried. Small acts had a longer reach than the people who performed them could usually see. She went back to work. Harlow General's administrative review of her termination concluded in March, 5 months after the night it had happened. The finding was unambiguous. The termination had been executed without proper administrative procedure by a department head who was himself under investigation for misconduct, using a disciplinary framework that had been applied selectively and retaliatorily. The termination was formally reversed. She was offered reinstatement with back pay for the period of her separation. She thought about it for a week. She thought about the 7 years she had spent in that department, what she had built there, and what she had been prevented from building, what she had learned, and what the environment had cost her in ways that back pay did not address. She thought about the patients. Favre, who had written her a letter in January, handwritten, 3 pages, forwarded through the hospital's patient relations office, describing what his wife had been told by the overnight social worker about the nurse who had flagged his rhythm twice before the code, and what he wanted her to know about what that meant to him. She had read it 4 times. She still had it. She thought about the nurses who were still there. Dominic, Dara, the respiratory therapist, who had looked at Vare's neck and said what she saw, even when it wasn't safe to say it. The nurses she didn't know yet, working night shifts in a department that was trying, under new oversight, to become something different from what it had been. She went back, not because it was comfortable, not because 7 years entitled her to anything. She went back because the work was there and she was good at it, and the thing that had made her good at it had never been the title or the badge or the security of belonging to an institution that valued her judgment. It had been the work itself, the paying attention, the knowing what a monitor was telling her, the willingness to say what she saw when saying it was inconvenient. None of that required a specific building, but this building needed it, and she knew the corridors, and she knew the patients, and she knew which things had been broken and which ones were worth trying to fix. She was back in the ER on a Friday night in April, her first shift, when Dominic appeared beside her at the nursing station with a coffee and an expression she had not seen on him before, something direct and unguarded, the face of a person who had made a decision about who they were going to be and was still getting used to it. New escalation protocol goes live Monday, he said. I know. I helped write it. Yeah. He nodded, handed her the coffee. Welcome back. She took it. The ER was doing what the ER always did at 7 on a Friday, filling up with the accumulated misfortunes of a week, each bay telling a different story, the monitors tracking the specific mathematics of people in crisis. She looked down the hall at the bays and felt the familiar pull of it, the particular alertness that the environment created in her, the sharpening of attention that happened when she was in a clinical space where things could go wrong and someone needed to be paying attention. She was paying attention. She had always been paying attention. The hard part had never been the seeing. It had been the years of being told that what she saw was irrelevant, that her judgment was a disruption rather than an asset, that the correct response to a monitor throwing a bad rhythm was to step back and defer to the person whose authority was larger, even when their attention was narrower. She had spent years navigating that architecture, pushing back enough to matter, not so hard that she was removed before she could do the work, and she had still been removed in the end, still been stood in a parking lot with a cardboard box, still been reduced to the particular smallness that institutions could impose on people when they decided that compliance was more valuable than competence. But she had also been in the bay when Dylan Vare arrived, which was not a comfort exactly, but was a fact. She had been in the parking lot, and she had heard the monitor, and she had gone back in. Whatever they had taken from her over 7 years, the formal recognition, the professional standing, the simple dignity of having her clinical judgment treated as legitimate, they had not taken the part that knew what attention pneumothorax sounded like from 30 feet away through a rain-streaked window. That part had never been theirs to take. She thought about that sometimes in the months that followed, when the work was difficult or the system was slow, or the process of rebuilding something that had been deliberately dismantled moved at a pace that tested her patience. She thought about what it meant that they had tried, systematically, to make her believe that the most essential thing she had, the knowing, the paying attention, the willingness to say what she saw, was a problem to be managed rather than a capacity to be used. She thought about how many people accepted that framing. Not because they were weak, but because the pressure was real and sustained and came from people with institutional authority and the ability to make the cost of resistance very specific and very personal. She thought about the nurses who had stayed quiet and the ones who had left and the ones who had kept records on their own just in case. And she thought about what it took to do any of those things under that kind of pressure. And she thought that the right response to all of it was not to be exceptional. It was to be clear, to know what you saw and say it, to document, to stay. The hard part was staying. She stayed. In June, Reeves called one final time, not about the investigation, which had wound through its legal processes and reached its conclusions, but about something else. A program. A joint military-civilian initiative that the Army Special Operations Command Medical Oversight Division was developing in partnership with 3 regional hospital systems designed to train emergency department teams in the recognition and management of combat-related traumatic injury patterns. The kind of injuries that arrived in civilian ERs from training accidents and veterans' delayed presentations, and the specific mechanisms that military medical personnel recognized on site and civilian staff sometimes did not. The program needed a clinical lead, someone who knew both worlds, someone who could stand in a trauma bay with a physician and a nursing team and communicate the difference between what the monitor said and what the patient was telling you with his neck veins and his absent breath sounds and his blood pressure that was lying about being stable. It's a 2-year appointment, Reeves said, based out of Reno. You'd split time between the 3 hospital sites and a training facility at Fort Hauser. Fort Hauser, she said. I know. She thought about it. About returning to a military installation, even in a civilian capacity. About the specific weight of that. It's a different building, Reeves said. Different people. I know that. Do you want a few days? No. She had known while Reeves was still explaining it. Yes. I'll do it. Good. A pause. Vare's going to be assigned to Fort Hauser in the fall. Limited duty. Transitional. You'll probably see him. I figured. She gave her notice at Prentice Valley at the end of June with thanks, because the work there had been real, and the people had been decent, and it had given her something she'd needed, which was the reminder that she could be useful anywhere if she paid attention. She told Dominic on a Thursday evening, after a shift ended, and he stood at the nursing station with his coffee and nodded slowly and said, "They're going to come back and ask me to run the escalation protocol training." Probably. I'll say yes, he said. Not a question. I know you will. She started the program in September. The first training session was at a hospital in Carson City, a large regional trauma center with a good ER team that was competent and well-intentioned and had exactly the blind spots she expected to find in a civilian department that saw occasional complex trauma but didn't have a systematic framework for what it was looking at. She stood at the front of a conference room with a case study on the screen behind her and looked at the faces in front of her nurses, residents, an attending or two who had shown up with the cautious body language of people who were not sure what they were going to be told. She started with the monitor, not with the theory. Not with the textbook description of tension, pneumothorax, or the anatomical explanation of why intubating it accelerated death. She started with what a monitor, professionally, it couldn't have looked like when a patient was heart fighting pressure it couldn't overcome, and what that looked like different from cardiac tamponade, and what it looked like different from simple pneumothorax, and how the neck told you things before the monitor caught up, and why the nurse at the bedside was always going to see it first. She talked for 90 minutes without notes. Afterward, a resident came up to her young, second year, with the specific expression of someone who had just had something confirmed that they'd suspected, but hadn't been sure was legitimate. The part about the nurse seeing it first, he said. That's actually true? She looked at him. The nurse is at the bedside. The physician is at the chart. Who do you think is watching? He thought about that. Listen to your nurses, she said. Not because they're always right, because they're watching the patient and you're watching the data, and sometimes those are two different things. He nodded and went back to his group. She drove back to Reno that evening through the Nevada dark, Tuck in the back seat, being philosophical about long car rides, and the highway was empty, and the sky was the particular black of a desert night, with the stars very clear and very far, and she thought about Black Ridge Pass and the 11 minutes in the valley and the field log that had sat in a safe deposit box for 3 years, and the backup that had lived in an unsent email draft in an anonymous account, and the way she had checked it every October just to confirm it was there. She had been waiting. She had been building. She had been doing it so quietly that even she hadn't fully understood that's what it was. Sometimes the work you do in the dark is not giving up. Sometimes it is the most deliberate thing you have ever done. Sometimes you are not hiding. Sometimes you are preserving something until the conditions exist to use it. She had been right at Blackridge Pass. She had been right about Gerald Farver's monitor. She had been right about Dylan Vare's neck. She had been right about all of it, for years, in rooms where being right had no protective value whatsoever, where being right was a liability rather than an asset, where the institution around her had been specifically structured to make her rightness invisible. The institution had been wrong. That was the thing she had come to understand, not as anger had been part of it early on, in the first year after Blackridge, when the formal findings had come down and she'd had 30 days to contest them, and no mechanism to do so effectively, but as a plain and sturdy fact. The institution had been wrong. The people who had built the architecture of her professional diminishment had been wrong, not just morally, but practically, in the specific measurable sense that patients had been harmed by an environment designed to silence the people who would have protected them. The correction of that wrongness had not been fast or clean or fully satisfying in the way that stories promised. Harwick had been convicted, but his sentence, when it came down, was something she had to make her peace with. Brackett had lost his license, but had not lost the years during which he had operated with impunity. The nurses who had left during his tenure had not all come back. Some damage was not reversible. That was true, and she held it alongside the other true things. Dylan Vare was at Fort Hauser in October, as Reeves had said he would be, on limited duty, walking with a slight hitch on the left side that would probably always be there, and that would probably be my metapragmatic acknowledgement of a man who had made a calculation and accepted the terms. She saw him in the corridor outside the training room on a Thursday afternoon. And they stopped and looked at each other the way people looked at each other when they shared a specific few minutes of shared history that had become part of the architecture of both their lives. "How's Rook?" she asked. "Dramatic," he said. "Good." "How's the hip?" "Functional." He tilted his head slightly. "How's the program?" "Growing." She meant it. In 6 weeks, they had trained 4 full ER teams and had requests from 2 more hospitals. The resident from Carson City had emailed her 3 questions in the intervening weeks, good questions, the kind that indicated someone was thinking past the immediate and toward the habitual, which was exactly the point. "We're adding a module on delayed trauma presentation in veterans next quarter." Vare nodded slowly. "That's needed." "I know." She paused. "Your field report from Blackridge. I want you to know that it mattered. What you filed, and the fact that you filed it twice, and the fact that it was in the log when they needed it to be there." He looked at the floor for a moment, then up. "I should have pushed harder. You should have been in a system that made pushing easier." She held his gaze. "That's what this is trying to build." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." They went in different directions down the corridor, and she went into the training room. The next session was about to begin, and she stood at the front of the room and looked at the faces in front of her military medics this time, a mix of enlisted and officers, particular alertness of people who worked in environments where the gap between the right call and the wrong call was not abstract. And she thought that the most important thing she could give any of them was the same thing she had always been. Trying to give not technique, not protocol, not the mechanics of the procedure. The permission to trust what they saw. The understanding that the hierarchy of authority in a clinical space was not the same as NAND, the hierarchy of correct information, and that the person who was watching the patient was always in possession of something. The person who was watching the chart was not. She had spent years being told that what she saw didn't count. She spent the next years making sure that no one in her program was told the same thing. That was the work. It was not glamorous, and it was not finished, and it was not going to be finished in her lifetime, because the systems that produced the Owen Bracketts and the Dennis Harwicks were not systems you dismantled in a single night or a single verdict or a single corrected military record. They were systems you changed incrementally, person by person, training by training, Every time someone in a room heard a monitor and said what they saw and was taken seriously. But you could do the incremental work, or you could not do it. She chose to do it. The woman they had spent years trying to make invisible had become the one building the room where no one's warning was going to be ignored again. Not because she was exceptional, because she had paid attention and kept records and come back through the ambulance bay door when she didn't have to, and told the truth in an 11-page deposition at 4 a.m. in a beige conference room while her photograph of her dog sat face down on a wet parking lot curb. She had not done it because she was certain it would work. She had done it because it was right, and because right was the only thing she had ever known how to be, and because no institution, however large, and no authority, however entrenched, had ever managed to take that from her. They had tried. She was still here.